Hey everybody, this is the stuff at the beginning of John R. Bell's Capitalism and the Dialectic, the Uno-Sekine approach to Marxian political economy. This book's from 2009. The table of contents are Preface, Introduction, Part 1, Dialectical Theory of Capitalism, Circulation. Chapter 1, Commodity Value, Money and Capital Forms. Part 2, Dialectical Theory of Capitalism, Production. Chapter 2, Capitalist Production. Chapter 3, The Circulation and Reproduction of Capital. Part 3 of the book is titled Dialectical Theory of Capitalism, Distribution. Chapter 4, The Theory of Profit. Chapter 5, Business Cycles. Chapter 6, Rent, Commercial, Credit, and Loan Capital. Chapter 7, Interest-Bearing Capital Closes the Dialectic. Part 4 is titled Capitalism in History. Chapter 8 is titled The Stages Theory of Capitalist Development. And Chapter 9, Conclusion, Capitalist Beyond Capitalism. Preface. This work aims to provide social scientists and social philosophers in the English-speaking world with a one-volume introduction to the Japanese Uno approach to Marxian political economy and social science, pioneered by Kozo Uno, 1897 to 1977, and substantially refined by Thomas T. Sekine. Moreover, it does so from a Japanese-Canadian perspective, given that Professor Sekine taught for many years at York University in Toronto, where with the assistance of Professor Robert Albritton, he formed a small group of local professors and graduate students who shared an interest in exploring and developing the Uno approach. That group, which I joined at its inception, has continued to meet for 3 decades, though members have now dispersed to academic institutions around the world. The Uno approach is best known for its distinctive levels of analysis approach to the study of the political economy of capitalism. Uno's claim that capitalism can only be comprehended by an approach that increases its theoretical grasp of the economic system by moving sequentially through 3 distinct levels of analysis: the dialectical theory of pure capitalism, the stages theory of capitalism's historical development, and empirical analyses informed by these 2 theories. This book will focus on the first 2 levels of analysis. The introduction and the first 3 parts of this book are devoted to outlining the first or primary level of analysis within the Uno system, the dialectical theory of pure capitalism. As an Unoist, I maintain that Marx's Capital was the first and regrettably unfinished attempt to develop such a theory, drawing on Uno's Principles of Political Economy, published in English in 1980 by Sekine, originally published in 1964, and more heavily on Thomas Sekine's imposing 2-volume masterpiece, The Dialectic of Capital, originally from 1984, and Outline of a Dialectic of Capital, published in 1997. I demonstrate how Marx's theory of capitalism can be corrected and completed to provide a rigorous scientific account of the logic which capital employs in its attempt to autonomously and personally manage material economic life. My book may demand somewhat more of the reader than Uno's text, which was itself a primer, but it makes far less demands upon the reader than Sekine's masterful but somewhat daunting 2-volume works, which are aimed at scholars who already have a good background in mathematical economics. I have eliminated much of the mathematics that is a feature of Sekine's tour de force, but I have maintained enough to demonstrate that a more rigorous approach to reproducing the Hegelian-style dialectical logic that capitalism employed in its attempt to regulate economic life in British liberal capitalism will allow us to eliminate theoretical problems that have plagued Marxian economics from the beginning. Once capitalism is theorized in a more rigorously dialectical fashion, the law of value and the law of relative surplus population will be seen not only as defensible, but as indispensable to the full comprehension of capitalism and capitalism's logic, while the seemingly insoluble, quote, transformation problem, end quote, will be overcome with relative ease. Indeed, it will be recognized that there are, actually two transformations, a dialectical transformation and a mathematical transformation, that take place as we depart the doctrine of production and enter the doctrine of distribution, to employ Unoist terminology. The 8th chapter of the book outlines the stages theory of capitalism's historical development. In this chapter, I draw on Sekine's as yet unpublished English translation of Types of Economic Policies, published in 1971. Uno's most fully elaborated contribution to the development of stages theory, and on Robert Alberton's A Japanese Approach to Stages of Capitalist Development, published in 1991. It's weird that they call it like the Japanese or like the Japanese Canadian approach. It's a stupid late name for what they're doing. The logic of capital can autonomously manage the production of the light cotton type use values, which were dominant in liberal Britain, yet a range of other commodities are always required as well. Thus, the economic policies of the bourgeois state and the leading capitalist nation in each major historical period of capitalism's development, mercantilism, liberalism, and imperialism, must be examined so as to determine why these policies were most successful in taming the resistance posed by the more intractable use values, thus making it possible for capital and its market to manage their production as well. I concur with Sekine in believing that our contemporary society is in a phase of ex-capitalist transition. Because capital can no longer manage an economic life of such complexity, even with the support of bourgeois economic policies. Nevertheless, I maintain that the dialectical theory of pure capitalism and the stage theory of capitalist imperialism, together with the general norms of suprahistoric, materialist substantive, economic life, that is, the norms that any viable and sustainable economy must observe to survive over an extended period, which are necessarily demarcated from the laws specific to capitalism in the course of the development of the theory of pure capitalism, are very useful for ascertaining not only how far we have traveled from a viable capitalism, but also how far we have to travel to establish a viable and ecologically sustainable socialism. These are topics I cover in my final chapters. I wish to express my deepest gratitude to Professors Sekine and Alberton, who have been sources of inspiration to me for over 3 decades. And I should also mention all who were members of the Toronto Uno group over the years. I wish to mention especially Nahama Miller, Colin Duncan, Richard Westra, and finally, Stefanos Kourkoulakos, whose brilliance impresses us all. I would also like to thank fellow Unoists John C. Moulidis and Joe Wheeler for their invaluable editorial assistance, endless patience, and penetrating insight. So that's the preface. Introduction. First section. Marx and the origin of the dialectic of capital. Karl Marx realized that it was neither a trivial nor a simple task to attempt to determine what it was about the nature of capital and its society-wide competitive market that allowed it to reproduce real economic life successfully, including the material requirements of the two major classes. When the state adopted increasingly non-interventionist economic and social welfare policies, as it did in liberal Britain, it was Marx's intuition that capitalism's survival in the laissez-faire era could only mean that the competitive market must be operating according to a rigorous logic, indeed a dialectical logic. The major task Marx set for himself in Capital was to uncover that logic in its entirety. It was a monumental undertaking that Marx was unable to complete. Nevertheless, Marx did not merely flirt with Hegelian terminology in his Capital. Neither did his employment of Hegelian language, concepts, and methodology compromise his scientific project therein. The structure and argument of Marx's Capital are quite properly dialectical and should be more rigorously so, as they might well have been had Marx's health not deteriorated such that he was unable to refine, correct, and complete that work during his lifetime. While respecting Darwin and Newton, Marx recognized that it is not possible fully and accurately to comprehend capitalism's laws of motion or inner logic by natural scientific methods. Marx tells us that, quote, in the analysis of economic forms, neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of use, end quote. Marx adds that, quote, the force of abstraction, unquote, must replace these, but that enigmatic comment is not particularly helpful when considered in isolation. Elsewhere, however, Marx tells us that, as capitalism matures, it develops its own capacity for self-abstraction. Quote, indifference towards any specific kind of labor presupposes a very developed totality and real kinds of labor, of which no single one is any longer predominant, ... This abstraction of labor as such is not merely the mental product of a concrete totality of labors. Indifference towards specific labors corresponds to a form of society in which individuals can with ease transfer from one labor to another, and where ... labor in reality has here become the means of creating wealth in general, and has ceased to be organically linked with particular individuals in any specific forms. End quote. Marx. Thus, labor may be as old as humanity itself, but before the modern concept of, quote, abstract labor, end quote, can be grounded objectively or scientifically, it is necessary that the development of the capitalist labor market, which achieves an indifference towards specific labors, has already taken place. Although productive activity is essential in all societies, it is the crematistic. Let me see how to pronounce that word, actually, because that's an important word for these people. Crematistic, which I think means something like commercial, but I'm not sure. Crematistic is an adjective meaning of relating to or occupied in gaining of wealth, particularly through the acquisition of money and possessions, often through non-productive means. The term originates from the Greek word krematisis, meaning, quote, businessman, or one who makes money. The noun form crematistics refers to the art or study of gaining wealth. What the hell am I? What's the word I'm looking for? Oh, sweet. Crematistics. I said it right. Although productive activity is essential in all societies, it is the crematistic form of capital that simplifies productive labor to the maximum degree compatible with the prevailing level of technology and, in so doing, establishes the labor theory of value, both as a scientific concept and as the organizing principle of the commodity economy. As Marx astutely recognized, the conceptual abstractions we use to correctly comprehend capitalism were first generated as real abstractions by the self-abstracting, self-defining, and self-purifying nature of capitalism itself. Marx mentions in a number of places that, before we attempt to understand or theorize the functioning of capitalism in history, it is necessary that we arrive at a full comprehension of capital's logic, its power of self-abstraction, its inner laws of motion, by theorizing a purely capitalist society in thought. In the theoretical space of Marx's Capital, Marx assumes that the laws of capitalism operate in their pure form. Thus, individual capitalist workers and landlords appear only as agents or personifications of the economic categories that capital itself generates. He informs us that, quote, a scientific analysis of competition is not possible before we have a conception of the inner nature of capital, end quote, and that this in turn entails, quote, evolving the different forms, end quote, of capitalism, quote, through their inner genesis, end quote. Marx's controversial statement that the laws of capital operate as, quote, natural laws, or, quote, tendencies laboring with their own necessity towards inevitable results, end quote, appears far less controversial if we think of these laws as working with, quote, iron necessity only in his theory of pure capitalism. In any historical capitalist society, these laws are reduced to powerful tendencies by the less than ideal conditions that capital must contend with in such environments. It is unfortunate that Marx would speak of the laws or logic of capital as equivalent to the empirical regularities we observe in the natural world, but it is true that, once reification becomes widespread, as in mature liberal capitalism, capital's commodity economic logic does tend to exercise a form of impersonal, external, quasi-natural, and thus seemingly unchangeable coercion over economic agents in all classes. Of course, capital's laws of motion can be suspended by collective human action, but because they appear to be equivalent to unchanging natural laws, such an eventuality becomes just that much harder to bring about. In the Grundrisse, Marx insists that to theorize capitalism's inner logic, or laws of motion, quote, it is not necessary to write the real history of the relations of production, end quote. Marx. And as unsettling as this statement might first appear, Marx tells us that, quote, the question why this free labor confronts him in the market has no interest for the owner of money, who regards the labor market as a branch of the general market for commodities, and for the present it interests us as little. We cling to the fact theoretically as he does practically. End quote. Marx. Marx did not attempt to incorporate a complete history of labor or labor power into his general theory of mature capitalism, firstly because, quote, human labor powers by nature no more capital than are the means of production. They acquire this specific social character only under definite historically developed conditions, end quote. Marx. Secondly, Marx could not focus on such important topics as how labor power originally became commodified, and simultaneously theorize how capital autonomously and impersonally managed and reproduced material economic life in mature capitalism after the commodification of labor power had already been achieved. Of course, the laying of the foundations for capitalism's management of the labor and production process is a worthy topic of Marxian historical investigation in its own right, but this rich tapestry which constitutes capitalism's making belongs, quote, to the history of its formation, not to, the capitalist mode of production, the conditions and presuppositions of, the arising of capital presuppose, that it is not yet in being, but merely in becoming. They, disappear as, capital arises, which, on the basis of its own reality, posits the conditions for its own realization, Capital as such, creates its own presuppositions by means of its own production process. These presuppositions, which originally appeared as conditions of its becoming, and hence could not spring from its action as capital, now appear as results of, its presence. It no longer proceeds from the presupposition in order to become, but, is itself presupposed, and proceeds from itself to create the conditions of its maintenance and growth. End quote. Marx. According to Marx, free competition and not an economy dominated by finance capital, in collusion with the state, offers the most solid basis for the reproduction of capitalism by means of capital's logic or laws of motion. In the mercantilist period, capital's laws operated only as weak tendencies, whereas in mature liberal capitalism, Marx tells us that, quote, the inner laws of capital, which appear merely as tendencies in the preliminary historic stages of capital's development, are for the first time posited as laws. Production founded on capital, posits itself in the forms adequate to it only insofar as and to the extent that free competition develops. For it is the free development of the mode of production founded on capital, the free development of its conditions, and of itself as the process which constantly reproduces those conditions. End quote. Marx. Marx also asserts that the further free competition is developed, the, quote, pure, the, quote, forms in which capital's motion will appear, end quote. He then qualifies his remark vis-a-vis the operation of Marx's laws as laws, and not merely as powerful tendencies. In mature liberal capitalism, He acknowledges that in history, capitalist laws never operate, quote, in their pure form, end quote. In reality, quote, there exists only an approximation, but this approximation is the greater, the more developed the capitalist mode of production, and less it's adulterated and amalgamated, and the less it is adulterated and amalgamated with survivals of former economic conditions, end quote. Marx. New section. From Marx to Uno-Sekine. Kozo Uno lived from 1897 to 1977 and was one of the first Japanese economists to conduct a serious and sustained study of Marx's Capital. Uno eventually concluded that the bulk of the content of the 3 volumes of Capital constituted a self-contained logical system, or genreiron. You're not finding any good words, any good translations for this. Might be a Japanese word. In order to strengthen the economic analysis of Marx's Capital, Uno found it necessary to rearrange the order of its exposition such that the structure of the argument came to closely parallel that of Hegel's Science of Logic. Uno isolated the first 2 parts of Volume 1, which treat the 3 simple circulation forms of the commodity, money and capital, and reconstituted them as the doctrine of circulation, a structure which happened to closely correspond to Hegel's doctrine of being. Next, Uno integrated the rest of Volume 1, apart from the last chapter on primitive accumulation, the whole of Volume 2 as to generate the doctrine of production, which corresponds rather closely with Hegel's doctrine of essence. Here the production process of capital, the circulation process of capital, and the reproduction process of capital are investigated. Thus, this doctrine first treats the process of the production of commodities as value inside the capitalist factory, secondly, as it continues outside the factory, and thirdly, as the macro interaction of these 2 processes in the accumulation process of the aggregate social capital. Finally, all of Volume 3 of Marx's Capital becomes the doctrine of distribution in Uno's reconstruction of Marx. The tripartite structure of this final doctrine, with its division into the chapters on profit, rent, and interest, may be observed to correspond much more closely to the tripartite structure of Hegel's doctrine of the concept than it does to Marx's arrangement in his Capital. But this innovation allows Uno to launch a much more effective defense of Marxian value theory than Marx was able to muster. While Uno believed that Marx had laid the foundation upon which the Dialectic of Capital could be completed as to expose the inner logic of capitalism, he was convinced that Marx's pure theory of capitalism, and more specifically his defense of the law of value, would have been more convincing if Marx had not only been more explicit about the nature of his method, but also if he had himself adhered to it more consistently. Had he done so, Capital would not have reproduced the structure of Hegel's logic more closely. Had he done so, Marx's Capital would not only have reproduced the structure of Hegel's The Science of Logic more closely, but, more importantly, it would have reproduced capitalism's inner logic with greater accuracy. Indeed, Marx makes many errors in his attempt to copy, retrace, or reproduce in thought the method which Capital employs in its attempt to regulate the material economic life of a society, because of his altogether too casual and intuitive employment of the dialectic. By adhering more rigorously to Marx's method than Marx himself, Uno was able largely to complete and correct Marx's explanation of the laws of appropriation, or logic, of capitalism, so as to produce a reconstruction of Marx's Capital and a defensive value theory that is impervious to the kinds of criticism which have traditionally been made of them. With its micro and macro theories based on the law of value and the law of relative surplus population, respectively, Uno's theory of capitalism lays bare the inner logic of capitalism, which may be thought of as akin to its, quote, software or, quote, program. That's actually a really good analogy, I think. It's very helpful. Uno's reputation was established with the publication in Japanese of the book The Theory of Value in 1947 and Principles of Political Economy in 1952. The latter was later translated into English by Thomas T. Sekine. Sekine has also made a decisive theoretical contribution to Uno's political economy in his own right by making explicit the Hegelian dialectical method employed intuitively by Marx and more rigorously and consistently by Uno. Sekine demonstrates that Uno's account of the logic of capitalism is not just another partial or one-sided, in the sense of both incomplete and ideologically biased, Marxist interpretation of the nature of capitalism, but a complete and objective definition or specification of capitalism by capital itself. The dialectic of capital is a method of theorizing or synthesizing a subject-object, quote, from within, end quote. The object of study is the subject, which, when questioned, must be capable of giving a full account of its operating principles, without distortions being imposed upon it by the interrogator. Sekine has also introduced significant mathematical and methodological refinements into the Marx-Uno dialectical theory of capitalism. His contributions are best viewed in the context of his major works, The Dialectic of Capital, published in 1984. I have the introduction to that on this channel if you're interested, and Outline of the Dialectic of Capital, which I read a long time ago. While the Uno-Hegel correspondence may have been an entirely fortuitous consequence of Uno having adhered more closely to Marx's method than Marx himself, Sekine has convincingly demonstrated that closer correspondence has strengthened rather than compromised the economic argument in the theory of capitalism. Yet when economic reasoning dictates that Sekine part company with Hegel, he does not hesitate to do so. Indeed, the Uno-Sekine dialectic is the most rigorous one we have available to us, if only because capitalism makes a better fit for the dialectic than does metaphysics. Unoists believe that the signal contribution of Marx's Capital to economic theory is the theoretical model of pure capitalism that Marx consciously began to develop therein. As Marx first recognized, capitalism carries in itself a tendency towards the realization of its abstract or idealized image as a purely capitalist society, making it possible both to envision such a society in thought and to reproduce its necessary interconnections as a dialectic. The core of Marxian economic theory thus ought to be nothing other than the dialectic of capital, or in other words, the definition of capitalism by capital itself. Uno and Sekine followed Marx's lead in acknowledging that late liberal capitalist Britain is the historical society which most closely approaches this pure capitalism. New section, A Reified and Inverted Society. The presence of crematistic or profit-seeking activity in a society is not sufficient to guarantee the emergence of a viable capitalism. Commodity exchanges originated in the mercantile trading of goods that took place outside of and between what were often widely separated communities. For capitalism to establish capitalism's self, these mercantile relations had to penetrate hitherto autonomous communities from outside. As commodity exchanges became widespread within a community, the human relations in it had to change from personal to impersonal, from person to person to reified or thing to thing, and from familiar or communal to mercantile or commodity economic. For capitalism to continue to develop, the direct producers had to lose any access to productive land and their means of production by which they had hitherto produced their own subsistence. They had to be rendered free to sell their labor power to capital, but they could not be free to do otherwise. Indeed, for capitalism to emerge from more limited forms of capitalist activity, human labor power, the ultimate source of productivity, had to be transformed into a commodity of a special type. Capitalism required not only that economic agents in the major classes increasingly surrender control over their real or substantive material economic life, to the operation of capital, its impersonal society-wide competitive market and attendant logic, but also that the logic of capital should prove itself capable of managing the production of the range of useful products, or use values as commodities that society required to reproduce itself. By the time the Industrial Revolution began in the late 18th century Britain, capital could purchase as commodities the production inputs capital needed, including the special commodity of labor power, to produce the light use values demanded with the technologies then available. The expansion of the market and the strengthening of capital's logic enabled capital to extend its dominion over the traditional uncommodified and peripheral regions of economic life. Up until the last quarter of the 19th century, British capitalism tended increasingly to objectify or reify economic relations as anonymous commodity relations, and in so doing, demonstrated a unique and considerable capacity among the things humans have created to largely transcend us, so as to be able impersonally and autonomously to regulate our activities as economic agents, quote, from the outside, and quote, whatever our social class. The goods produced as commodities, the money commodity generated by commodity exchanges, the society-wide market and modern mechanized machinery, though originally human creations and our helpmates, not only mediated between, but also subjugated economic agents in this inverted society. Although commodity relations tend to prevail in an increasingly universal way, British society did not collapse or break down. Rather, it experienced unprecedented, albeit uneven economic growth. Social reproduction was no longer guaranteed by the direct human relations of dominance and subservience that had characterized earlier societies, but increasingly by the anonymous, impersonal, and reified market. The capitalist market could regulate price, profit, and wage levels such that the principal classes of capitalists and workers receive the revenues, wages, and commodified use values required to ensure the reproduction of both capital and labor power. Moreover, the workers who supplied labor power to capital did not collectively offer the kind of organized, sustained resistance to capital that would have posed a serious threat either to capital's management of the economy or to the capitalist management of individual factories. British liberal capitalism increasingly displayed an innate capacity to move towards or realize a purely capitalist economy, but since there was always some use value in human resistance that capital's impersonal market could not overcome simply by applying its, quote, dull compulsion, end quote, on capitalists and workers alike, the study of history will not fully or precisely expose capital's logic or the precise limits of its powers. New section: the necessity of pure theory. Only in the capitalist era does the economy tend to, quote, disembed, end quote, itself from the society that hitherto enveloped it. As Karl Polanyi might have put it, so as to become self-defining, self-regulating, and self-expanding, thus allowing us to conceive of the, quote, economic, end quote, as distinct from the concepts of the, quote, social or the, quote, political in a manner that pre-modern scholars could not. Indeed, the modern social sciences developed because of the largely autonomous functioning of the economy in the liberal capitalist era. The market's commodity economic management of real or substantive economic life made it easier to recognize that the material foundation, not only of capitalism but of all historic societies, is provided by economic relations, whether or not the economic realm is autonomous, as it is in capitalism, or merged with the political and religious realms as in traditional societies. If we adopt this perspective and so make capitalism the referent to all other societies, it is incumbent upon us to ensure that our knowledge of how that economic system operates is as accurate and complete as possible. We need not settle for one-sided definitions, models, or ideal types of our economy, because we both require and can have an objective, complete, and scientific knowledge of the operating principles of the capitalist economy, which is not the case for feudalism or other forms of traditional economy or society. To lay bare the inner logic that allows capitalism simultaneously to self-synthesize and to reproduce material economic life, we cannot rely on a facile method borrowed from the natural sciences. Even if the capitalist economy were still functioning in a largely autonomous fashion today, we could hardly study it in the laboratory as is possible when one is investigating certain objects in the natural sciences. We must find an environment in which to examine capital's capacity for self-regulation and self-definition. Fortunately, although a purely capitalist economy never emerged, liberal capitalism did overcome use-value restrictions to a sufficient degree that it became possible to conceive of or to synthesize such a society in theory, and thereby to reveal the goal or telos that capital is striving to reach through the operation of its logic. If indeed mature liberal capitalism was largely governed by a commodity economic logic, it should indeed be possible for us to reconstruct that logic in thought by what may be referred to as, quote, method copying, end quote. Our theory does not attempt to copy its object of study directly. Rather, it reduces or follows capitalism's method of self-abstraction, or self-synthesis. A scientific concept such as capitalism cannot be formally defined once and for all in a few sentences. To define capitalism fully, we must contrive a, quote, idealized use-value space, end quote, in theory, wherein capital can perform its own abstractions without being impeded by external contingencies, such as intractable collective human use-value or natural resistances, which would be sufficiently powerful that capital could not overcome them by its autonomous and impersonal operation. We then may reactivate and copy capital's logic or laws of operation without in any way interfering with them. Only when an object like historical capitalism manifests a real tendency to approach its abstract or idealized image by a process of self-abstraction can a valid theoretical abstraction or image of it be derived by, quote, method copying. Capital's dialectical logic or inner laws of motion only operate in their pure form in this idealized use-value space, and only those use-values appear there that capital, its market and logic would be able to produce without active or economic social welfare policy intervention on the part of the bourgeois state. Thus, only in the pure theory do we see, 1, capital's laws as laws, rather than as tendencies of varying strength, as they would appear in any historical setting, due to the presence of varying degrees of intractable use-value resistance that capital cannot autonomously overcome. 2, the full extent of capital's capacity for autonomous self-regulation and self-reproduction. 3, the limits of capital's capacity to maintain labor power in commodity form, assuming that workers do not collectively resist capital, as they would do to varying degrees in any historical capitalism. The theoretical and idealized use-value space of pure capitalism, which reproduces the unfolding of capital's commodity economic logic to arrive at a synthetic definition of capitalism by capital, is akin to the space that Hegel provides for the absolute in his The Science of Logic. The absolute exposes himself in the realm of pure thought prior to the development of the philosophies of nature and finite spirits. I'm pretty sure the absolute in Hegel is like akin to God. And it makes sense that the text here says the absolute exposes himself in the realm of pure thought prior to the development of the philosophies of nature and finite spirits. The dialectic of capital also allows capital, its subject-object, to self-develop or self-abstract in the realm of pure thought, so as to expose its logic as a synthetic abstraction rather than as an axiomatically detached one. Capitalism is thus confirmed, not as a subjective, arbitrary, one-sided, and therefore dubious formalization of our historical experience, but rather as the only valid theoretical abstraction of a historical capitalism, which existed to the extent that it was self-abstracting or self-defining and self-purifying. We obtain the idea of capital as a Hegelian-style absolute by rendering our economic motives infinite. We first, quote, one-dimensionalize, and quote, human beings, reducing them to Homo economicus, or to the capitalist as the personification of capital. And then we imagine such a being doing infinitely, pursuing profit, or abstract wealth and capital accumulation, single-mindedly and unceasingly, that which we humans can only do finitely. Once capitalism reached its mature liberal phase, capital did indeed attempt to promote the pursuit of abstract wealth / profit / capital accumulation without limit, but could never quite achieve the status of a Hegelian absolute in any historical environment. Indeed, the emergence of capitalism, with its concomitant modifications of labor power, was a contingent historical development due to the fact that our social lives have historically involved use values of incredible variety, most of which were not easily commodifiable. Capitalism developed because of its suitability for the production of light, relatively simple use values, such as the woolen goods of the mercantilist and formative era of capitalism, or the cotton goods of the mature liberal and industrial capitalist era. It existed only to the extent that it was able to maintain a reified, inverted, or upside down, and quote, unnatural society, and for this, the use value environment or space in which capital operated had to remain such that capital's grasp over substantive or material economic life could be maintained. This largely self-regulating economy thus had a comparatively brief span as a historical institution. By the time the liberal era drew to a close, capital and its society-wide market could no longer overcome the resistance posed by an increasingly complex use-value life, so as to maintain the momentum it had previously established. Even though the state intervened by developing economic policies to support the market by, quote, internalizing externalities, end quote. For example, by dampening use value and collective human resistance. Rather, throughout the imperialist era of 1870 to 1914 and beyond it, capital progressively lost its grip over material economic life, so much so that in the era of the Great Depression, capital and its by then atrophied market no longer had the ability either to successfully regulate or to revive the economy by themselves. The dialectic of capital successfully theorizes capitalism as a unique, logic-governed mode of production. Capitalism exists historically only to the degree that this logic operates. The pure theory does not aim to or claim to know historical capitalism in all its empirical detail, but only that which appeared as a necessary consequence of the operation of capital's commodity economic logic. An abstract conceptual theory which allows us to grasp the limits of capitalism's capacity for self-organization when it is confronted only by the most tractable of the use values it found in various historical contexts, does not exist to make predictions with regard to the future course of capitalism. Rather, it provides us with a suitable reference point or a framework of necessary economic relations, which we may use to evaluate or determine whether a stage of capitalism still prevails in history in the face of varying degrees of collective human and use value resistance, or whether these contingencies have undermined capitalism's logic and moved us away from a viable and sustainable capitalism. The operation of capitalist logic does not automatically lead to the system's breakdown or to revolution. Collective human resistance to capital is a manifestation of human freedom and not a product of dialectical laws. The Uno-Sekine stages theory of capitalism's historical development must therefore give due weight both to the force of capital's logic as it's operated in a given historical period, and to the major forms of use, value, and collective human resistance to its operation that it contingently confronted. The dialectical theory of pure capitalism is such a significant advance over neoclassical economic theory, precisely because the dialectical theory of pure capitalism maintains clear distinctions both between the general norms of superhistoric economic life that all viable economies must observe and the commodity economic principles specific to capitalism, and between the production in pure theory of the logic inherent in capitalism and the subsequent theorizing of how that logic plays out in capitalism's historical stages of development, where its operation is always impeded by use values and collective human resistance. New section. The limits of social science and natural science. Marx insisted that abstraction must replace experimentation in the study of capitalism. Sekine adds, however, that it is crucial to distinguish between A, an arbitrary or subjective abstraction, such as an ideal type, and B, a dialectical abstraction that copies or reproduces in theory a process of self-abstraction that was inherent in the object under investigation. The dialectic of capital need not and ought not to important to its field of investigation the empiricist, positivist, and instrumentalist methods, commonly employed by natural scientists and enthusiastically initiated by neoclassical economists. The positivist belief that there is only one scientific method, which is typically taken to be derived from physics and then subsequently applied to the study of not only the natural sciences generally, but of the social sciences as well, is an extreme form of methodological reductionism. It would be ludicrous to suggest that any society is irrevocably given to us, quote, from the outside, end quote, as a quasi-natural order that we must conform to. Nor must any society retain a, quote, thing in itself, end quote, that forever remains opaque or unknowable to us. It is we humans who create and recreate societies, including capitalism, no matter how natural and eternal it may appear. The partial and proximate knowledge of the natural sciences may indeed be nothing more than, quote, so far so good, end quote, and therefore tentative hypotheses, conventionally accepted for the present and subject to refutation or falsification by the further progress of natural science. But it does not follow from this that social science will be unable to entirely divulge or to lay bare the inner logic, laws of motion, or operating principles of a social institution such as capitalism, because they are mentally straitjacketed within their positivist-inspired metaphysics. Bourgeois economists cannot entertain even the possibility that a human-created historical subject/object such as capital might develop a considerable capacity both to self-manage and to manage human economic activities, and thus, for a finite period, to be able to largely transcend us in its impersonal regulation of those activities. It is the method of dialectic that is appropriate for the objective and scientific comprehension of such a subject/object. That said, it can be readily conceded that the dialectical method of uncovering complete knowledge of a self-revealing, self-abstracting subject-object cannot be legitimately employed in the natural sciences. Nature reveals no teleology to us. We cannot see or reproduce nature's logic, quote, from the inside, end quote, and come to know definitively that complex and ultimately unfathomable reality because we did not create nature. In short, we cannot grasp the, quote, concrete logical idea, end quote, or noumenal, quote, thing in itself, end quote, of nature as we can with capitalism, which we put in place. Because nature will not completely reveal its operating principles to us, as capital does, a dialectic of nature or of matter is an impossibility. The stage theory of capitalism's historical development. Uno's claimed that Marx was not only the first to recognize the necessity of theorizing pure capitalism, but also that he recognized that capitalism operated differently in its formative and mature industrial periods, and that each period must thus be theorized differently. According to Marx, in the formative period, quote, trade dominates industry. In modern society, the opposite, end quote. The consequence of this is that while capital always engages in crematistic pursuits, mercantile capital operates in a manner that is, quote, directly contradictory to the concept of value, end quote. Prior to the development of the putting out system, quote, to buy cheap and sell dear, bracket, was, and bracket, the law of trade, end quote. Consequently, quote, where commerce rules industry, where merchants' capital promotes the exchange of products between undeveloped societies, commercial profit not only appears as out bargaining and cheating, but also largely originates from them, end quote. Marx. During this formative period when primitive accumulation took place, force and fraud were routinely employed. According to Marx, force is the, quote, midwife of every old society, pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power, end quote. However, in mature liberal capitalism, quote, direct force outside economic conditions, bracket was, and bracket used, only exceptionally, end quote. Rather, economic actors were subject to the, quote, dull compulsion of economic relations, end quote. I mean, Marx himself kind of talks about how, I mean, the counter to this, of course, is that, the development of capitalism was also coupled by, like, the development of the penal system, contemporary penal system in Britain. So the dull compulsion of economic relations was also coupled by a very stringent and violent protection of private property rights. So that's something to consider, but it's not probably particularly important for this argument. Similarly, money lending capital, the antiquated form of interest-bearing capital, also depended on, quote, robbery and plunder, end quote, in a way that the latter could not typically do, given the maturity of the market economy. For Unoists, Marxian economics is a discipline that studies real economies in the light of the commodity economic laws established in the theory of pure capitalism. A stage theory, Dankeron, which I guess is the Japanese word for it, aims to be a meaningful and necessary intermediary or crucial link between the singular, abstract, general, and deterministic theory of pure capitalism, Genreon, which represents an extrapolation of an increasingly powerful reifying tendency that prevailed in modern Western economic life up until the late 19th century, and the concrete, specific empirical realities of diverse capitalist societies that could never be made totally subordinate to this tendency. Because use values are never, in fact, as tame as they are supposed to be in the abstract world of theory, stage theory must bring the logic of the pure theory together with the more realistic use values which dominate a particular historical stage before evaluating the working of an actual capitalist society in history. A levels of analysis approach is, thus, indispensable for comprehending capitalism. To characterize each stage, I draw primarily on an unpublished English translation of Kozo Uno's Types of Economic Policies Under Capitalism, which has since been translated into English, and on Robert Albritton's A Japanese Approach to Stages of Capitalist Development, published in 1991, which represents a critical appropriation of Uno's basic approach to characterizing the stages of capitalism's historical development. Sekine explains that the Unoist stage theory of capitalist development plays a mediating role between theory and history, which corresponds to Hegel's real philosophy. Hegel believed that his dialectical logic corresponds with metaphysics. When Hegel applied his logic to the material world of nature and finite spirit, he expected that the cunning of reason would ultimately prevail there too, but not without some distortions due to omnipresent contingencies. Similarly, the dialectic of capital exposes capital's essence. Capital is such, in a purely capitalist society, which exists only in the theoretical realm, while the Uno stage theory of capitalism examines the unfolding of capital's logic in historical environments. Where not all use value or collective human resistance can be overcome by capital's autonomous operation without undue strain. Sekine conceives of a historical stage of the development of capitalism as a, quote, material, rather than a, quote, ideal type, because the characterization of a stage is made in light of the dialectical and therefore deterministic pure theory. The stages of mercantilism, liberalism, and imperialism in Unoist theory are, thus, Hegelian-style, quote, alienations, or, quote, corporeal manifestations, unquote, of the inner logic of capitalism in given historical and technological environments and use-value spaces. The characterization of the, quote, material type of a stage, unquote, is thus objectively unique rather than one of many partial, that is, one-sided and necessarily biased, ideal types, which are arbitrarily constructed, subjective images of capitalism, as it is observed from the outside, much as we would observe a natural scientific object. Sekine uses the term, quote, use-value space, unquote, to refer to the concrete specific context within which the material economic life of a historical society evolves. An enormous variety of use-value spaces have existed throughout our history, but few could have been organized successfully by the logic of capital. Only those spaces in which many key use values are capitalistically producible as commodities can be subsumed under the logic of capital and are, hence, amenable to its control. All capitalist use value spaces in history are less than ideal for capital. In any historical capitalist society, there will always be some forms of use value, human and natural resistance, which capital's logic will not be able to manage. The capitalisms we experience in history result from specific combinations of the logic of capital and particular, less than ideal use value spaces. This resistance may distort the shape of business cycles or obstruct the operation of the laws of value and average profit. However, so long as the market still tends to achieve an optimal allocation of resources in its subphase of average activity, without having to rely on the planing principle of the state in any other capacity but an auxiliary one, capitalism will remain viable. Nevertheless, Unoists recognized from the outset that the cunning of capital will not indefinitely be capable of overcoming human use value and natural resistance, even if it has the support of the bourgeois state. Since capitalism in history only arises when the dominant use values that a society requires are readily producible as commodities, the development of a stage theory of capitalism's historical development must originate in a consideration of the relationship between the operation of capital's logic and those crucial use values which it must manage in a particular stage. To say that historical capitalism must contend with varying types and degrees of use value resistance in the different stages of its maturation is to say that the extent to which all use value production is undertaken as the production of capitalistically produced commodities by means of commodified labor power also varies from stage to stage. Each of the three stages is thus characterized by the typical use value space that prevails within a stage. Thus, the types of use value production that actually dominated each of the world historic stages of capitalism must be introduced. In this context, systematic disturbances in the operation of the law of value occur because capital is attempting to produce use values which are not the idealized cotton-type light use values that appear in pure capitalism, with technologies that are harder for capital to manage than the light technologies that appear in pure theory. In the context of stage theory, the capitalist is no longer simply the personification of the motion of capital in the abstract, but is rather the organizational form with the modus operandi most suited to the production of the dominant use value in that stage. In the period of mercantilism, the dominant form of capital was merchant capital. For competitive capitalism, the dominant form was industrial capital. And for imperialism, the dominant form was finance capital. In the mercantilist period, the key use value was woolen goods produced under the putting out system. In the liberal era, it was cotton goods produced by small entrepreneurial capitalists in atomistic competition. In the imperialist era, it was heavy iron and steel goods produced on a large scale by oligopolistic joint stock corporations. Since these were the most, important, manufactured, products in each stage, the accumulation of capital occurred most typically in these industries. The sequence of wool, cotton, and steel in stage theory is not a necessary sequence because it cannot be shown that the transition from one stage to another is necessary, nor can it be shown that the logic of capital must be externalized sequentially in only these three stages. Given the dominance of certain typical forms of production, however, it is possible to demonstrate how the logic of capital must operate in these circumstances, even if the circumstances themselves are not logically deduced from pure theory. In a purely capitalist society, where use values are idealized or presumed to be more manageable than they actually are, and the logic of capital operates without help or hindrance from any political agency, the nation-state and cross-border trading are absent. The division of the capitalist market into distinct national markets is a contingent matter, which is not part of the logic of capital. While the pure theory can be formulated only when the use value space is rarefied, idealized, or made abstract, real capitalism presupposes a concrete specific use value space, which is never completely subsumable under the logic of capital. This implies that in real capitalism, there are bound to be, externalities, factors that exceed the operating principle of the capitalist market. In stage theory, we must begin to confront these externalities, and we must accept that historical capitalism must operate within the framework of a nation state, and this in turn implies the presence of international trade and payments. Whereas the dialectical theory of pure capitalism only explains how the economic substructure of capitalism would operate in an ideal use value space existing in thought, where the only use value resistance which is tolerated is that which capital's logic can autonomously overcome. In stage theory, by contrast, the dominant capital form of a particular historical stage must always receive stage-specific superstructural assistance in the form of the appropriate state economic policies. The most appropriate policy is the one which most effectively manages the dominant use value within that stage. State power and policies must be present to, internalize, or to reintegrate externalities, or to tame intractable use value and collective human resistance, so as to make them subject to the self-regulating mechanism of the capitalist market. If the use value space is such that its externalities are capable of being internalized by the economic policies of the bourgeois state, capitalism remains viable. If not, capitalism will become moribund. Although state economic activities establish the conditions under which the inner logic of capitalism works its way out in a particular period, they are not generated by that logic. Capitalism, which produces commodities by means of commodities, including commodified labor power, exists only to the degree that it is a logically self-contained, self-dependent, self-regulating, and self-reproducing system. If capitalist activity has largely come to depend on the finance and economic policies of the state, which capital does not generate through its own autonomous motion, then the capitalist mode of production must already have collapsed. When the dominant nations of the world are capitalist, a world historic stage of capitalism evolves with stage-specific international economic relations. A world historic stage of capitalism is best understood by examining the pattern of development in the dominant or leading state. Once the dominant form of capital and its stage-typical mode of accumulation have been correctly identified, it is possible to determine which states' economic policies most effectively support this capital accumulation, and thereby most adequately serve to guarantee capitalism's survival. Because state economic policy plays a fundamental role in each of the major periods of capitalism's historical development, stage theory derives the names and distinguishing characteristics, which it applies to the three stages of capitalism, from the public finance and trade policies which prevail in the dominant nation in each of these eras. Each stage of capitalism is characterized not only by a particular use-value space, economic policy, and class structure, but also by the type of energy which fueled economic development within that stage. As the pure theory makes clear, capitalism tends to develop through successive business cycles, and in each, the organic composition of capital is raised such that the rate of profit tends to fall in each successive cycle. In the mercantilist stage, the dominant energy source is wood. In liberalism and imperialism, coal was dominant, although in the latter stage, capitalism began to rely as well on electricity and oil, albeit to a limited extent, prior to the widespread employment of the internal combustion engine. The stage theory recognizes that each stage has a finite lifespan because, although profit rates never successfully fall to zero, the introduction of new production technologies, whether wood-based or coal-based, will eventually be unable to raise profit rates enough to provide capitalists with the incentive to continue capital accumulation. Thus, if capitalism is not to be placed in serious jeopardy, a new source of energy must be found that can effectively and dramatically raise the productive powers of labor far more than the technologies relied on previously. Although our focus in this introductory book will be confined to the study of stage-specific economic policies, this does not constitute the full range of stage theoretic studies. Particularly important would be the role of public finance as it affects and is affected by economic policy within a stage. Public finance aims to achieve an economic accommodation of diverse sectional interests, whereas economic policy, to be successful, must bolster capital's capacity for self-reproduction. Just as Hegel thought that the empirical sciences, when not mediated by the philosophies of nature and mind, were thoughtless, Unos contend that empirical studies of historical capitalism are blind if undertaken without regard for the inner logic of capitalism, even if the logic, because of its abstract nature, cannot directly or fully explain the complexities of actual historical evolution of capitalism. Thus, dispensing with the intermediary stage will either vitiate the integrity of any abstract theory of capitalism or promote an unduly mechanical view of historical capitalism. Once the pure theory and stage theory have been developed, however, empirical studies, informed by the former, may accommodate any concrete and factual information that is necessary to give as detailed a picture of any aspect of historical capitalism as is required. New section: the Uno-Sekine approach to non-capitalist societies. The Marxian tradition has always recognized the contradiction, tension, or incongruity in the gap between what capitalist commodity economic logic is attempting to achieve and the recalcitrance of use values in real economic life. Capital is capable of managing material economic life only as society's use value requirements remain within a very narrow range. something that would not be the case in any historical society for any extended period. Indeed, the logic of capital is never completely subsumed the quote, use value space and quote, of any historical society. There have always been quote, externalities and quote, which capital could not overcome by its own autonomous motion. Thus, even if knowledge of that logic does not show the inevitability of the system's collapse, it does make it obvious that any historical capitalism can only be transient. Capitalism is far from being the liberals' ever-present possibility. I follow Uno-Sekine believing that it is fruitless to attempt to theorize the post-1945 economy as a new and viable stage of capitalism. Our economic life today entails the production of heavy and complex use values and the provision of technical services by transnational corporate oligopolies, which can be regulated by the capitalist market. Cannot be regulated by the capitalist market. The present global market is not viably capitalist. It is not capable of overcoming the imposing use value resistance, to employ Marxian terms, or of, quote, internalizing intractable externalities, end quote, to employ the language of neoclassical economics, so as to reliably reproduce substantive economic life. When society requires products such as automobiles, jet aircraft, hydroelectric systems, nuclear plants, or information and communication technologies, state and superstate agencies must also participate in the management of economic life. In the contemporary post-Fordist era, radically labor-saving technologies are being introduced in industry, not just in the developed world, but also in the key developing nations. At the same time, capitalist activity is actually retreating to the interstices of economic life, as financial speculation, asset accumulation, and the redistribution of existing wealth substitute for growth in the real economy, which has become difficult and ecologically unsustainable. Globally, working people have to contend with the specter of permanent marginalization, underemployment, and the enclosure of what remains of the global commons. This means that in the developing, and poor nations, a significant proportion of the population will not be integrated into the corporate-dominated global economy, but few will have the option of retreating to subsistence agriculture to survive. Consumers today are massively manipulated by corporate producers prior to their purchase of consumer durables and high-tech gadgetry, in a fashion that would have been unthinkable in the capitalist era, when the available resources, prevailing technologies, and market power that relatively small capitalist firms could marshal were insufficient to undermine so thoroughly the autonomous formation of demand. This consumerism, which is a consequence of the sovereignty of producers rather than of consumers, is nevertheless becoming difficult to promote due to ecological considerations, the satiation of the affluent minority, and the decline in the standard of living of many in the hitherto affluent societies. If we have the wisdom and courage to recognize that the contemporary economy is no longer viably capitalist, we can then pose the question as to how Uno's levels of analysis approach might be fruitfully employed in this era of ex-capitalist transition. The pure theory not only provides us with a solid reference point from which we can measure just how far we have departed from a viable capitalism, as I endeavored to demonstrate in Chapter 9, it also allows us to clearly isolate or demarcate the general norms of material or substantive economic life. The general norms of material or substantive economic life, which must prevail in any viable, sustainable economy, from the commodity economic logic or law specific to capitalism, with which they might otherwise be conflated, and then to evaluate how successful our society has been in observing those norms. The knowledge provided by the pure theory also enables us to rethink socialism as the society which definitively transcends capitalism by eliminating impersonal commodity economic coercion, without, however, introducing direct physical coercion into our substantive economic life. Finally, the theory of the imperialist stages allows us to examine what strenuous efforts the bourgeois state had to make to devise a policy which would, quote, internalize, and quote, which will, quote, internalize intractable externalities, end quote, or tame intractable use value resistance in heavy industry so that the logic of capital might continue to operate. We can then appreciate why such a policy would not be successful today, when heavy and complex use values dominate our economic life to an extent that would have been unthinkable in that earlier era.